Hey guys, it's Ryan with Between the Liars, back with another episode of Blueprint, the limited series I'm recording with Ken from Taboo Topic, where we envision a smaller, more accountable government. This week we discuss congressional salaries, benefits, and stock options. If you think Congress shouldn't be allowed to give themselves a raise in the middle of a recession, or pass legislation and then trade stocks with inside knowledge of how their legislation will affect their portfolios, then this is the episode you're going to want to listen to. I hope you enjoy episode 2. Be sure to check us out every Friday. Come back for more.
We're going to do a quick recap from last week's discussion because we had a great discussion. It came up with a lot of compromises just between the two of us, and we made a comment concerning, imagine if there's like Barcelo in the room or Josh from the Alt Left podcast in the room, just how the diversity of thought and the ins and outs that people can think of that would have happened if it was just more than the two of us. And you and I very closely aligned ideologically speaking. But last week we went over congressional term limits, and we came up with one of the few compromises we came up with was that at least we were going to have the states decide how to handle term limits while at the same time have at least a 20-year cap. I think you and I bounced around a little bit with the idea as far as maybe 24, but I think you and I ended up settling on 20-year cap.
That was 20 years on the federal level. They come back and serve state and local, right? Was that correct?
Yeah, and then we also compromised as far as the president, that once the president serves his time in office, whether it's one term or 2 terms, he cannot be eligible to run for an executive position back at the state that he came from. That's also something we compromised on. So all in all, good discussion, but I think we did miss a few points, but I don't know if you have any missed points you want to bring up right now. I'll let you take the floor.
Ken, I don't make mistakes.
Never wrong. Wrong.
Exactly. No, I think that I got most of my thoughts out there. There was nothing really burning in the back of my mind. I was like, oh man, I wish I would have said that last week. But why don't you, I'll probably come up with something as you say stuff too. So why don't you tell me what you were thinking you wish you would have said, and then.
Yeah, we really fleshed out. So this recap and going over missed points.
That's what organization does to us.
Yeah, as far as missed points, I mean, this probably will be like a 10-minute part of this show, to be honest. But one thing I did think of right after I would have said like yesterday, actually, I thought of this as far as like making sure in the amendment process anyway to ensure that those who serve their 20 years for that federal official, let's say, for example, they go back. Let's go use Obama for example again. Okay, let's say Obama goes back to Illinois. Illinois votes like, no, sorry, kick rocks. I want to be sure there's a amendment in place that ensures that Obama can't just go to another state and claim residency there and then try to run for office just for the sake of being in power. That's something I thought of yesterday.
So you're saying that you want to have the states determine whether or not a president can come back and serve at like the state or local levels. So we're talking like state Senate, state House of Representatives. We already said that there would, in theory, in our world, be an amendment that says that they cannot serve in the executive, or in this case, the governor's branch of the state. But you're saying that basically they would only be eligible for which state? The one that they went to before the presidency? Like, how would you determine that?
So I was thinking of ensuring that they can only work at the local level or state level at the state that they originated from when they started their 20-year career, essentially. And I want to make sure that they can't just bounce to another state that actually allows them to serve even at we already agreed to no executive position, but you shouldn't not just president, but just anyone in the federal level. Like if you're a Senate and you go back to your state in Kentucky, and Kentucky says go kick rocks, I don't think the person who originated from Kentucky should be able to go to Tennessee, for example, where Tennessee says, yeah, you can go ahead and serve here.
I was wondering if we should just make it a federal amendment then, that they can't go back and serve, period. Because otherwise you're going to get some people from some states who get to go back and serve and others who don't. and I'm torn because I like to delegation to the states, but at the same time, I'm also concerned that some people will make some like super politically strategic moves like I'm not gonna start my career in Illinois because I can't do it, so I'm gonna move to Tennessee and I'm gonna live there as long as I need to. And you know what I mean? Like I don't know. I feel like that's a big obstacle for them that it might not even be worth their time, but it's still an obstacle they might try to get around. I don't know.
Uh, did I just like destroy the 20-year cap from last week?
No, not the 20-year cap. I meant
Or the
the.
returning back to serve at your local politics?
No, I'm just thinking out loud. I don't think you destroyed it. I suppose that even if you've got people who can or go back and serve their state, I don't know. I feel like I have never, even though presidents are currently not limited, I've never seen them go back and serve. Like what do the presidents do? They look terrible by the time they get out of their 8th year, and they usually go into some form of retirement. Usually it's where they start, selling their name and their branding, right? We've seen this largely from like the Clintons and the Obamas, a little bit of the Bushes, although I feel like George W. Bush went and did more with painting than he did with politics and writing, as far as I'm aware. So I don't know. I'm not going to change my answer. We'll go with the 20-year cap, but it also is decided by the states whether or not they want someone who served as president to be able to come back to their state.
Okay, that's fair. I mean, personally, I would say at least make it ingrained in the Constitution that you can only serve back to the state you originate from when you first start the 20-year cap. Um, I guess it's one of those things as far as like, do you trust the human nature enough to not want to go to someone to not try to look for that loophole? And I don't, and my instinct is I don't trust human nature.
Yeah, no,
um,
I don't. I'm doing this series because I don't trust human nature, and I think that politicians are a special type of weasel. Like I'm naturally distrusting of people and humanity in general, but especially so of politicians. So no, I don't trust them.
yeah, maybe. And so the other point that I didn't think about is when I was actually watching the Tim Pool podcast where they're talking about a convention of states, which that was honestly the first mainstream conversation period that I've heard. When I say mainstream,
Yeah.
it's my idea of mainstream, like Tim Pool, Joe Rogan. I feel like CNN, Fox News, like they're becoming dinosaurs. They're not really mainstream anymore. But Tim Pool actually had like Rick Santorum and Heckler on there, who was I guess in charge of this push to have a convention of states, which is awesome. That apparently we're really freaking close to actually having a convention of states, and it's terrifying Congress and the federal government because they literally can't do anything about it. But one thing he mentioned, as far as the congressional term limits, they actually brought up an interesting point that I think you and I could probably get over real quickly and probably agree on, as far as the federal cap that we agreed on. Should that be including any federal member, whether it's a cabinet member or the staff from Congress? Should they all be included in this 20-year cap? Yeah, so Tim Pool on the show, they were talking about congressional term limits, but they also wanted term limits or limit the amount of time federal members can serve. So whether it's like a cabinet member, like let's say Dr. Fauci, for example, right? Like limit his time, how long he can be in this position kind of deal, or any staffers from Congress. And I'm asking, do you think that should also be included in your 20-year cap?
So you're not just talking about Senate and Congress now. You're talking about like any federal service. Now, my question then would be, would that include, let's say, like FBI agents, because like technically they're working for the government, or are you talking about
Well, in my
upper
world,
leadership?
let's go with upper leadership, because in my world, the FBI doesn't exist right now.
Okay.
In my idealistic world, I'm in the boat right now of abolishing the FBI, but let's go with the latter of what you just mentioned, the higher up officials like like people like Dr. Fauci kind of deal? Do you think you think the cap should include those individuals as well?
I don't know. My initial knee-jerk reaction would be no. And my main reasoning for that is I feel like I like a certain amount of freedom for people. And I think that there is something to be said, and we talked a little bit about this last week. There is something to be said about the knowledge that you gain through the experience, and you can only get experience by having a certain number of years racked up. I'm worried that if we just said, yeah, 20 years, then you wouldn't get the crossovers of like, and I know you're not talking about this specifically, but think for a moment about how much value we place on the commander in chief having previous military experience, particularly when we were in war times, right? We haven't seen that lately, but we did, especially, around and shortly after World War I, World War II, the Vietnam War. And I'm worried that if we start imposing those types of limitations, that you won't have the knowledge, the know-how, the experience, and even the connections that you need to get things done. Because, I mean, even just for us average Joe Schmoes or Jane Schmoes,
Inclusive.
that you need to know people to get things done. And when you get a good old boy system, or you get the lifers in Congress, which has now been called the swamp, there's problems that accompany that. But I am worried that you might reach a point through that type of limitation where Congress, or with whether they go from Congress to serving in other capacities or vice versa, that you'll get people who don't have the experience they need to truly be effective. Now, I know that there's an argument against that too, so that's why I'm a little torn here. But I think I'm more concerned about people who don't know what they're doing trying to lead the country than I am about those people skipping around, or even people from Congress going off and doing that.
That's a good rationale. Yeah, because we did go over as far as what the reasons why why the founding fathers originally said no term limits to Congress is because they wanted that experience.
Right.
And I'm just thinking about Dr. Fauci. Dr. Fauci is like the first person I think of. He's been there way too long.
But
And
like also he's fallen out of relevance. I mean, he keeps trying, or like they keep trying to make him relevant, but he's really not anymore, right? Like he had his rise. Like nobody knew. I mean, most people, I'll say, not nobody. Most people didn't know who Fauci was outside of the last, couple of years that COVID's been dragging on. It's
fair.
really it's just been there. So I mean, I don't think that Fauci is going to be my reason for anything. I think he's irrelevant. I don't think that he would be my reasoning to limit that type of potential for experience. For me anyway, that's the way that I would handle that.
But at the same time, though, do you want a good old boy in there where he has his connections with the president, for example, that lets him keep his job? And I'm not just talking about Dr. Fauci, but I'm just taking like a Dr. Fauci-like scenario at that level. I'm against career politicians, but I'm also against the lifelong bureaucrats who eventually gain the system to their advantage and use it to their advantage. And so I agree with you in the experience, but maybe I would compromise with you and say maybe let Congress handle that, and maybe if they want to like write legislation that states that those official members can only serve a certain amount of period, they can, or that's their limit. But as far as maybe ingrained in the Constitution, like I would let that go. I think as a compromise, as far as constitutionally ingrained, including them in that 20-year ban.
So let me ask you this: outside of, I'm trying to think how to phrase this, outside of them just being around forever and ingrained in the system, what is the harm that you currently see to those people being lifers outside of the Senate, outside the House of Representatives, and the president isn't relevant because the office of the president has limits on it already. So what do you think are the harms of these people just perpetually leeching off of the system today?
They would come up with policies and advise presidents or advise the president on policies that are not based on reality, and they would be so out of touch with reality because they've been in that there so long that, I mean, Dr. Fauci, for example, like he hasn't practiced medicine in over 20 years, for example, and he calls himself Dr. Fauci, so still calls himself a doctor. And
Well, you don't
so,
lose your degree. I'll fight you tooth
well,
and nail on that, because when I finish my PhD, I will be doctorate of philosophy. But
my
that doesn't go away.
God.
Even if I left, I have that forever.
Yeah,
Same for an MD.
but the thing is, at the same time, as far as if you're always up there, you're not with the people. You're not going to understand how policies affect these people and how your guidelines, for example, affects the average Joe or Jane. So for
Well, I think you're
me,
exactly correct. You can lose touch for sure.
I don't think you can. I think that's the most likely. I mean, it's probably like 90% of the time that ends up happening with these bureaucrats to stay up there and serve over 20 years at least. So I would venture to say, like, there has to be some kind of limit as how long they can be up there, especially if they're unelected officials.
For
um,
sure. So,
and go ahead.
well, for me, the main issue I have with Congress and the Senate droning on and on and on and being lifers there is because they are writing policy, or they've just given up on writing policy, which honestly, how many members of Congress are actually writing policy? Not many. They usually pass it off to their underlings to write it up, and then they just vote on it. But they're actually pulling the levers. They are effectuating changes for better or for worse, or not doing anything, and then then we put a fire under their butts. But for these lifers who are not in a congressional position, I understand what you're saying about they can influence the president, but they are not the president, right? Like, Fauci didn't get to write legislation. He got to make recommendations, much like pick any number one of these people who have been a lifer. They're not necessarily able to effectuate policy. They just get to advise. So for me, I don't see that as being quite as damaging. I think what you said about them losing touch is 100% correct. I agree with you on that. I just don't think that they have the capability of doing as much damage given their position, and because of that, I don't know, my perspective is that it would be more damaging to not have these people to advise. Right, because Donald Trump would be a great example of this. He got in, he had no idea, for the most part at least, what the actual political landscape was like. What made him attractive to a lot of people was that he was not one of the politicians, but that also made it very difficult for him to get anything done because he didn't know the process. So he relied very heavily on these people that he appointed, or that went in there with him, or that were in these positions, and their knowledge. I mean, I guess I'm thinking of what would we have had if we had Donald Trump in office, who was very limited, and then we also didn't have any of these lifers who had experience of here's how things are done. I guess I'm trying to be very careful that we don't blow up the system for the sake of blowing it up. Right? By definition, conservatives prefer to conserve, which means that they like slower change, and they often look at this as there's a reason for the system. We're not saying everything's good. We're certainly not saying it's perfect, but we're not saying blow it up. Versus progressives would say blow it up. I see a problem, blow it up, start over. I'm worried that if we impose that, then now we're going down the path of, I just don't like that these people are lazy and that I'm paying my tax dollars towards them. Right. And I think that's a valid gripe. However, I don't think personally that's a reason to nuke that part of the system. I'm all about nuking Congress's ability to stay in there for life, because they're supposed to be doing change. And I think that nuking that opportunity for them to sit there means that they can no longer be complacent, because they can be voted out, or if they just try to write it out, they will be gone. So if they genuinely care about change, they'll try to get it done in that 20-year stint. But also it means that, we can't have Nancy Pelosi just being like, yep, like she literally said, you put, a glass of water in my district or AOC district, and you slap a D on it, it's going to get elected. I think that if you have to have fresh blood every single, every so often, I think that means that people will look more at policy and less of, oh yeah, I know Nancy Pelosi because she's been there for 97,000 years and she's a Democrat, so I know that she's going to vote against Republicans. I think that we actually have to look at, because how many times have you gone to the polls other than, the last couple of years when we were doing this podcast, right? Before you really gave a crap about politics, How many times did you go and just say, oh, yeah, I know Mitch McConnell's name in the state of Kentucky because he's been there forever? And you don't look at the policy. I know that was me. I mean, maybe that wasn't you, Ken, but like I feel like the majority of Americans only do the name recognition of the incumbents, and that's why they're there forever. So that's why I want to nuke that. I don't care quite as much about the lifers and the other portions.
Well, they are part of the executive branch, and so we won't get into the
They are.
executive branch today. That will be when we talk about the president and the whole cabinet members down the road. So we'll come back to that some other time. But since we are on the topic of Congress, there's a few times last week where you now were walking a fine line from jumping in from congressional term limits to talking about pay. And I know you're really interested in talking about the benefits aspect. So let's go ahead and get into that. That's going to be the main topic for today. Really, it's just the pay system because, listen, I think to a sane individual, you would think that Congress should have something to hold them accountable from giving themselves bonuses. And there is some kind of measurement in the Constitution where the bonuses they give themselves or the raises they give themselves doesn't take effect until the next congressional session, I guess. But that's as far as it goes. Doesn't really get too into it. Now, when it comes to the founding fathers and their thoughts about this, is again one of those things our founding fathers debated heavily on. And any point that you and I bring up, that was one of those points that the founding fathers brought up. But it's one of those things again where they ultimately decided to go in another direction. So Benjamin Franklin, for example, he didn't want Congress to be paid at all, stating that if Americans, were to have Congress members up there who did get paid, that they would become bold and violent in their personalities and engage in selfish pursuits. Well, even though at the time that wasn't the case, I think that portion has aged pretty well. But the reason why they ended up going the other way is because they felt as though if they made it to where Congress could not be paid, those public servants could not be paid or be compensated, then the only people who would be able to afford to be a congressional member would be those who are rich. So maybe they thought there would be only the Bill Gates of the world could afford to be a congressional member. And that's what they were worried about. And perhaps that was an overcorrection that you brought up last week as far as no term limits. For the sake of having experience, perhaps that was also a overcorrection. Now, from 1789 to 1850, the pay was absolutely terrible. They're making a few bucks daily. Their starting salary up until 1815 was $1,500, which is a year. That's what a salary is. Sorry. Anyways, which that would be the equivalent of a low enlisted pay of $22,000 a year. So very terrible. And it was low enough for them to actually get jobs. And it stayed that way. And in 1935, again, not really high. It's only $10,000 a year at the time. But inflation calculators suggest that would have been the equivalent of $200,000, which is what today's congressional members get paid for pretty much. More closer to $200,000 dollars a year. The leaders, such as the House Speaker, Senate Majority Leader, Minority Leaders, their pay is around $170,000 a year, and that's not taking into consideration they gave themselves a 21% bonus in the Ukraine foreign aid package, which next week, if we get through this in one piece, we'll actually be going into the single bill issues and that whole process. So that'll be good. But right for this week, Ryan, let's keep on track. Let's stay on track and focus on the pay stuff. So that's pretty much it as far as the pay aspect. There's some concerns as far as they're being paid too much. But there's also concerns about their benefits, which, Ryan, that's something you really wanted to harp on last week. So I'll give you the floor for that one if you want to give us the gritty details of the benefits they have.
Well, sure. So one of them is called franking, which is basically they don't have to pay for the They don't have to pay out of their own pocket anyway for any of, those stupid, annoying little reelect me, every time that they're up for re-election. Like they don't have to pay for the postage for that. They've got to pay to print them and things, but they don't have to pay for the postage. Now that franking is only, if I'm remembering correctly, it's only supposed to be for like official business, right? That's pertinent for their duties. Does that mean it gets abused? Sure. But they're not supposed to. Now, they also get, just being a member of Congress, you get special carve-outs for like dental, vision, and medical. You get your, you get some kind of an allowance, basically, which is supposed to offset. So, like, in addition to making about, what did you say, 75,000 a year.
Oh, you're talking about their salary?
Yeah.
220,000 a year salary.
Let's see here. 174 is what I meant. Sorry. So let's see. Rank
for the House Speaker. Okay, yeah.
Well, yeah. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi makes 225 roughly, 174,000 per year. They also get to retire. Like if you serve an appropriate number to be eligible, like a certain number of terms to be eligible, you can make like 80% of your salary. So they're making like, 80,000, let's say, a year when they're not doing anything. So they retire and they make $80,000 a year. So they got really good retirement options. They've got special 401k. It's not quite a 401k, but they've got those options as well. The Capitol Hill has all types of dining services. And I don't know if all of their food is free, but I know a lot of times maybe their stuff gets catered, or they've got lobbyists that are paying for their food, or you've got all of these lunches. Like, they even have stuff that's like a cafeteria where like they probably don't have to pay to go in. Like there's a lot of perks and benefits to being in Congress. Now, personally, I'm not opposed to Congress making a salary. I just don't think that they need to make $170,000 a year plus, expense accounts, travel, compensated, all of that. It's like, okay, well, I've got to mail stuff. How come I don't get to do that for free? Like, because,
right.
And it's also not for free. It means that the tax dollars go towards that. They just don't have to pay for it. And that's something that we need to remember, is that nothing is free. It came out of somebody else's pocket from the fruit of their labor. They are making way more, well above the median salaries or even the mean salaries for what their districts are making. If you're at the state level, it's just a lot of it's a lot of money to also then turn around and not even show up for your roll call vote, right? Like the only time that these people have to show up is when roll is called, because then you get the yays and the nays. Other than that, they do more like representatives of the representatives, right? Congress is supposed to be representing the people. We are a representative democracy. We are a republic. You elect them, they go and serve you. That way you don't have to go in every time that, a vote is called on every piece of legislation. What they're doing, though, is like, okay, we know that the Republicans have fewer people. They have a minority in the House and the Senate right now, so not everybody even shows up. It's ridiculous. So they're being paid that much, $175,000 on average, for just your average member of Congress to then not even show up and do their job. They're not writing legislation. They're certainly not reading it. Now, sometimes they're not even given the time to read it, and that's a whole other problem. But they're being paid massive amounts of money, in most cases, to do nothing. Now, one of the benefits to being paid, you mentioned that they had to work side jobs back in the day. You want your Congress to be free to be able to focus on doing legislation, like to do their job. You also don't want, like you had mentioned a little bit ago there, Ken, you want them, you don't want the position to exclusively be open to the Bill Gates of the world, the Nancy Pelosi's of the world, like the people who come from family wealth. So being compensated fairly for your time, I think, is important. I'm not saying do away with all of the salary altogether. I don't think it needs to be strictly a service, but I think that in the spirit that you are serving your country and this is a privilege, and that you need to remember that you are accountable to we the people, I don't think you need to make $225,000 a year for you to turn around and only pass legislation that raises your bonus so that you can offset inflation.
Well, I am... So this is where you and I will break a little bit, I guess, because I don't really mind the benefits so much as long as their salaries are within reason. That's my bigger deal. Um, that said, these are my proposals as far as, and this is another thing though too, as far as like you said, like our taxpayer dollars are paying for them. We're paying for their salaries. And if we're paying them, then shouldn't we be the ones in charge of whether or not they get a raise or uh, or should they just be able to give themselves raises whenever they feel like it? And I feel as though that lack of check of balance has allowed them to go ahead and pursue this. That vagueness, if you will, has allowed this to happen to where, they've lived up to Benjamin Franklin's fears at this point, where they've become leeches in the system and they've become very arrogant and cocky and brazen in their legislation to allow themselves, despite the will of the people and their people in the districts or the people in their state saying, hey, we don't like this, don't pass this, they do it anyway. To say that the fact that there's no check of balance to hold their checkbooks and say, hey, listen to us or you're going to get a cut, or maybe not necessarily a cut, but at least not, definitely not a pay increase at the very least. So that's my biggest ordeal. Go ahead.
I was gonna say I'm with you 100% on that one, especially because what they voted for recently, especially in the misnomer bill that they just passed, the Inflation Reduction Act, sure as hell is not going to reduce inflation. It's going to make your dollar not go as far, right? That's the definition of inflation here, and you're seeing them vote for these garbage policies without any regard for the consequences. Now, that might be in part because they're trying to get an agenda that they want through. It might be in part because some of them are trying, especially like the Democrats and the left, are promising their constituents these types of policies, so they're following through. But I also think a part of it is that they are not beholden to the same salary restrictions that we are. When I go to my boss and I'm like, hey, I want a pay raise, they're like, LOL, no, that's not going to happen. Versus these members of Congress get to say, all right, raise your hands if you want to increase the pay. It's like, well, yeah, no shit. They're all going to raise their hand and vote for that. Now, some members of Congress turn down the pay increase, but in my opinion, those are the idiots. It's like you should not have the option. So I agree with you there. Congress should not have the ability to raise it. I think that it should go to the people. And I'll give you another reason that needs to be the case. Imagine Congress coming to us right now and saying, hey, we want to raise. They would be laughed out of the country. So I think that's another incentive, another check on them to do their freaking job and actually pass legislation that will benefit the country. Because I'm still not going to vote for Congress to get a raise, but I think that they'll have a better shot if they're having to, be accountable to us to get that raise. And so, bottom line, what I want to see, I want them to suffer with the rest of us. If I can't outpace the inflation they've created, they sure as hell should not be able to either.
For sure. I mean, and there's also this unspoken or unofficial benefit that they also have. I will going back to the benefits, the insider trading, where they basically get the scoop before the next day in the stock market, whether or not certain stocks, whether they're going to crash or they're going to skyrocket, they're going to see a rise, and they can get ahead of the curve.
It's not even a scoop, though. It's they're passing legislation that shapes the economy. That's like, if if I eat Mexican food, I can predict that I'm probably going to have a stomach ache. If I eat too much food in general, like that, that's like, you don't have to be Rain Man to be able to make that type of a prediction. When they pass a policy that's going to heavily restrict the ability for U.S. companies to be able to drill, well, probably a good time to dump your oil-based stock at that point then, right? Or if they're going to pass legislation that gives incentives to any company, like automobile company, that will do something with EVs, electric vehicles. Probably a good time to invest in Tesla. So like it's not even the scoop. It's that they literally get to shape the legislation that affects the economy. And because they know what's going to pass and when it's going to pass, and unless you're a super nerd like me who's massively pissed off, who's tracking congressional bills, you probably don't know what's going through. Now, you've also got the part that, it's a little more of the even, further down the road of insider trading, like what Nancy Pelosi deals with, where, she's got, it seems, there was a whole page dedicated to tracking Nancy Pelosi's stocks so that you could do better, and that page got suspended. I think it was on Twitter. But yeah, I mean, it's a massive problem. I think it is downright despicable when Congress gets to pass legislation that then affects the economy and they get to profit off of it.
And they also vote for a raise on top of that.
Exactly. So you got multiple issues going on there. Now, one of the solutions, if we want to talk solutions real quick on that, this was one thing that pretty much everybody on Between the Liars wound up agreeing on, is that, no shit, Congress shouldn't be able to be investing in the stock market. One of the solutions that we kicked around then that I would still be in favor of is, I'm not going to say Congress can't invest in stocks. I would say that they have to put their money into like a blind trust, which, think about it as like, kind of like Congress can kind of pool their money into something that is invested on their behalf so that they do not know what it's going to be invested in, and they just have to pass policies, right? It's blinded, much like the way we're flying is blind, right? You don't know. You can study the stock markets, you can try to figure stuff out, but it is up to chance. What's not up to chance is when you're going to put $400 billion into subsidizing other types of energy and cracking down on carbon-based energy. Doesn't take a genius to figure out probably where each of those is going to turn.
So would they not be able to directly, let's say, buy Apple stocks if they wanted to while they're in Congress? Is that what you're saying?
Right. So think of it as like, I'm trying to remember. It's not a Roth IRA, but there are. Let me hold for 1 second while I try to find this term. Come back to me.
Yeah, so for me, I guess when it comes to that specifically, I just think about, personally anyway, I personally don't mind them being able to trade stocks as long as it's not for their own person, as long as it's not behind the scenes and they provide that transparency for the American public to know. So it's like, if you have this power, then the people should also have the power to look in to see this as well, to know ahead of time, so they can also take advantage of the stock market per se. I personally don't. I guess that's my biggest issue personally, more than anything. I like your idea though, as far as putting in a blind trust. I think that's a way to ensure, because at the end of the day, they can say they're going to provide the transparency, but will they actually enforce it? And 99% of the time, they don't enforce it. They may give you like half truths per se on certain things. And so putting in a blind trust, I could see it. I could see that working, as long as it's a third party and they have absolutely no connection to that company that they're putting the blind trust in, and they don't know anybody. Maybe they make the blind trust come from a totally different state they've never resided in or they've ever stepped foot in, just to avoid that conflict of interest, to where they can't just like call Joe Schmo and say, "Hey, Joe, I'm not saying to do your job, but we just passed legislation to incentivize Apple to go ahead and start building more of those iPhones. Wink, wink. I'm not telling you to do your job." That's my thing, I guess. So that would be like the flaw I would see with that.
No, I agree. And I think what you said hit it on the head, talking about how they shouldn't be able to have that type of an advantage coming out of it, because then, yeah, you're not in the same boat as the rest of us. And this is also true because I mentioned earlier, it's not what you know, it's who you know as well. So,
right.
I mean, I would not even limit this to, say, Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi's husband should also not be allowed to invest. I would say anyone who is in Congress and their families should have to invest if they're going to through a blind trust. Because Nancy Pelosi's doing this song and dance right now where she's like, well, I've never, told my husband that, but it's like, well, that's BS, like you're definitely sharing privileged information at that point. So even though she's like, well, I've never invested, it's like, yeah, but your husband has. It's the same thing, and that's just not the way that it should be.
I can see that. At the same time, though, like a part of me is thinking that's a little unfair for the families. At the same time, though, it's I guess just one of those opportunity costs. If you want to serve Congress, the family's going to have to put up with it, kind of deal. So how far down the family tree would you say would be affected by this? Would it just be their immediate family, or you're saying like anyone that's related to Nancy Pelosi, for example, they cannot participate in the stock market?
I would say absolutely no one in the immediate family should be allowed to do anything other than a blind trust. I would also say that I'm heavily considering limiting anyone who is close enough to benefit from their political office, right? So when Nancy Pelosi's husband literally gets pulled over by the police and when I was here and it was pretty heavily speculated that he was drunk driving and, waves basically his privilege card, and then Nancy Pelosi is like, well, I don't have to come down and testify because privilege. Like, if you are close enough to benefit to their connections, I think that you also don't get to complain if you get this setback, right? Like if my cousin is a member of Congress and I get the connections, then I also shouldn't be able to invest. And that would also, I think limit. Because, like, here's the thing. If I say, yeah, your husband can't, they'll be like, well, you didn't say my cousin couldn't do this. So, then, then I just pass that off to, cousin Jerry or, whoever is just, he or she happens to get the information now. So I would just say, limit it to definitely immediate family. I would probably say just anyone who's, cousins, aunts, uncles, like the whole 9 yards until you start getting like the second cousins once removed. Like, I don't think your children, grandchildren, grandparents should be able to invest. By all means, invest in a blind trust because like you already have stock options like that. Like if I'm not mistaken, like a Roth IRA is you're basically investing in like a bundle of stocks in the market. You're diversifying your portfolio, which is kind of what a blind trust is anyway. You're just, it's just that there's a little more collaborative teamwork. I mean, hell, if we can't get Congress united on issues, get them united on the fact that they all want the economy to thrive because they're all in it or their pension suffers together. Like they're all in it together, better or worse.
I guess for me, because for me, it would be that would get tricky at the same time as far as like, well, how can you tell which family members that are not immediate that are really close to? You basically have to do like a background check, I guess,
Who
on
could
families.
figure that out? The $87 billion they just put into the IRS. They could figure it out.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, true.
They just hired, 87 million agents or something with the call to be able to use deadly force?
An entire football stadium.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, if you Congress, let's see how much Congress likes putting $87 billion towards the IRS when they have restrictions and now they're going to be enforced.
Oh, well, of course, part of their legislation that will be covering next week, obviously, as far as, the nature of bills and everything like that.
Yep.
They're going to tried in those bills or laws, they're going to write themselves an exemption so they don't have to worry about the IRS agent. Yeah. So they don't have to worry about the IRS agents. But let's kind of switch back to the not payment, but the salary portion and the pay, because, I mean, all that aside, those are reasons why Congress should not have the salary they have, nor should they have the right to give themselves bonuses. It makes no sense. So these are the proposals that I have written down on my Substack, folks. If you want to check that out, it's the under Kenja296.substack.com, and the title is Smaller Government, Congress, and it's in this section talking about pay. And what I have here is first point. Congressional delegates from both chambers must possess and maintain a profession outside the congressional chambers. They are forbidden from practicing as lobbyists as a secondary job. Delegates cannot be paid by lobbyists as a means of constructing a secondary job either. A profession outside the congressional realms include anything that serves the public through the private enterprise system, the Defense Department, healthcare, or academia. Point 2. Any citizen who aspires to run for office must have a minimum of 16 years without any association with lobbying to minimize conflict of interest. Point 3. Congressional base salary must not exceed the average accumulated secondary salaries of each delegate. As part of the electoral process enshrined in the Constitution, the individual citizen will have the power to vote in the ballot box on whether Congress has earned a pay increase, stagnation, or decrease, but the increase or decrease of the base salary shall not exceed the inflation rate. So let's say, for example, they decide to do a decrease. They can't just they're not going to see their salary see a significant job as long as it's within the inflation rate. And if they were trying to give themselves, or if the voters decide to give them a raise because they're doing a good job somehow, then they would only go up as far as the inflation rate. So they have these ridiculous numbers like 21%, 30% pay increase to kind of hold them in check. And then the enforcement of this amendment shall take effect 2 presidential cycles after this passage. But that's really the end of that. That was the nitty-gritty portion. So Ryan, go ahead and tear that down as you wish or please.
Well, so I would say one just to the whole, you can decrease their salary like that. Or how often did you say that they would go up for review, basically?
It's based on the election year. So if your senator is running, if there's an open seat in the Senate that year, or there's an election for the Senate seat in your state that year, then they get to vote on it. And same thing for the House. I mean, every 2 years, they would vote on it as far as whether or not their district members went ahead, earned a pay increase. So, yeah.
So I would say one of the biggest issues with that could be that, let's say you're running for office and I was the one whose seat is up for re-election. So you and I are running head to head against each other.
Hell yeah. I'm the MAGA person.
Then what happens is people are reacting to how I did in Congress and taking it out. Let's say I lose on you. So, for example, let's say I did an abysmal job. I put us in a recession. And so then let's say I get voted out, and then you get voted in, and they get to vote on whether or not there's a salary increase, decrease, or it stays the same. If they're really pissed, they'll probably vote to decrease it. So then you're walking into a decrease, and you haven't even been in Congress yet. So my concern is that wouldn't, aside from being a lot of things to vote on and potentially muddying the waters, I don't think you're really punishing the right people. Maybe to tweak that a little bit, maybe the person who is out of Congress, their pension options should be, going down. I don't know. I would even just say maybe just not, we fix congressional salaries and then they can never raise them. And the only way they could ever possibly get raised is if the people raise them, so that, let's say 100 years down the road, God willing, this country's still standing. And they're like, oh, guess what? Cost of living is really terrible now. We need to raise the pay. Then they could. But I don't want it, to be a constant or even fairly regular option. I want Congress to have a fixed salary and not be voted on. And I think that if the people are going to continue to vote on something, I don't know. I think that I'm more concerned about them voting on people who are going to do a good job and then letting them take out their frustrations by just not putting the person back in office or replacing them, instead of also penalizing the person after. So those are my initial thoughts on that.
So let me ask you something real quick, just as a reminder, refresher. How often do we have to fill out the Census Bureau?
I actually don't know.
I think it's like every 10 years, something like that, right?
I can do a quick ye old Google if you hold on just 1 second.
Because I'm thinking maybe an alternative to what I just mentioned is include that in the Census Bureau as part of the filling out portion. And so they're not necessarily voting on whether or not on the specific member. Let the specific member just vote. Let the voters decide whether or not they want to keep that individual to remain in Congress, and then in the Census Bureau they
That is
decide
every
whether or
10
not.
years. You were
Okay, yeah.
correct.
And then within the Business Bureau, then the voter can decide whether or not, because that's a very general, broad statement, right? As far as the questions are the same with everyone. They're not asking you specific your personal sentiment about whether or not the tax increases are effective or not. They're like basic questions as far as who you are as an individual, where you're from, what's your ethnicity, blah blah blah. And I think another one that could be included there, maybe as an alternative, is include, does Congress deserve a pay raise? And then based on the majority popular vote around the United States, they can decide whether or not Congress will get a pay increase, remain the same, or decrease. And then from there, for the next 10 years, they can't raise or decrease until the next Census Bureau. And also, if it's an increase or a decrease, it cannot exceed the current inflation rate at the time the Census Bureau, at the time they finally decide they get the final numbers in.
Well, let me ask you this, Ken. So anytime you do a bare majority like that, or even just like, let's say, I'm assuming you're talking about like 50% plus one person, right? Like just a super bare majority, and then it either gets raised, decreased, or kept the same. Tell me if I've misunderstood anything here.
You got it.
Do you want and do you trust the people of the U.S. enough to let them keep making those shifts? Because I don't know. Well, let me ask you this. Do you think that Congress has ever done a good enough job that you would want your taxes raised to be able to give them a higher salary? Because, like, for me, the answer is hell no. Not, not even close.
Right.
And like, I understand that yours gives the option even for us to decrease it. And I understand that that's the point, but I worry with how little some people pay attention to politics and then they still go and vote, that they would be voting on something that they have no understanding of outside of maybe the way that the economy is currently going. Because that really seems to drive how people vote, right? Like when Republicans are in charge and the economy is bad, then Republicans get voted out. And when Democrats are in power and the economy is going poorly, they tend to be voted out. That's been the trend for like the last like 25 plus years. And I feel like people react more to the way that they feel in the situation than they do, actually like merit based, which is what I feel like yours calls for. Like, have they done a good enough job?
I think a merit base is the way to go when it comes to whether or not Congress should give themselves a raise. I think if we're going to pick between letting the people decide versus letting Congress decide, even though the population, there's going to be people who vote who may not necessarily understand everything that's going on. I think I trust the people to decide more, to vote on whether or not Congress deserves that pay raise versus Congress themselves. I think that's where I'm coming from, because I
No,
don't.
I agree. Anything is better than them being able to vote
Yeah,
for themselves. I agree. What I'm
yeah.
thinking though is that we don't have to pick between those two options. Like the options here are whatever we want. They don't have to be Congress raises it or the people do. So why if we make it a constitutional amendment that it is set at this rate and they cannot raise it, that can be changed if we get our little calling of the states and then they vote to amend it. I guess my question is, why would you choose to let them have that option every 10 years instead of just letting them call it whenever they want a constitutional convention to raise, lower, or keep it the same?
Because a constitutional amendment is a pain in the ass, and let's say
By design.
by design, I get that, and we haven't had a convention of states before, and
Right.
so if the project actually works, which it looks like it's about to actually work, and to have an actual convention of states, it will be the first time in our country's 200 plus year history. And when it comes to the congressional way of amending the Constitution, I mean, if they want a pay increase, I mean, they can just go through the constitutional amendments. A lot easier for them to just do through the congressional means, and they can even change the Constitution to where they don't have to do with that limit anymore, and have to uh, go through the constitutional process just to give themselves a raise. And
But if
so, go ahead.
You know that Congress cannot amend the Constitution without that being put out to like a true populist vote, right?
Correct.
It was sounding kind of like you were thinking, though, that Congress could get around the inability to raise it, though, just because they could pass a constitutional amendment. But maybe I misunderstood you.
They still would. They still would, but probably a lot more. And for me, it's one of the things. It's like I see on the television, and it's what like almost have Congress trying to give themselves a raise and justify why they need a raise. I'd rather not have to deal with that as a voter personally. And so, and it's one of those as far as I think I trust the people. I don't I understand where you're coming from when it comes to the maybe someone may not be necessarily educated enough, but I think it should be left to the people to decide whether or not at the end of the day they should be able to get a pay raise. And I don't think, I mean, let's say 20 years down the road, like inflation's way beyond their means, way beyond what their salary can afford. And granted, like with by amendments, they would not be just working as congressional members. They would have secondary jobs as well. But at the same time, should they have to wait? Should people have to wait that long to get a pay raise to accommodate the inflation rate? To me, it doesn't seem economical. That's just me, though.
So it sounds like you're accounting for them having a second job as well. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so for where I was coming from, I was thinking that they don't need to have a second job. I mean, speaking as someone who's lived on a grad student stipend, I mean, you can live well below what most people think you can, as far as like what you actually need for your expenses, especially considering the fact that Congress has all of these perks and benefits, right? Like they, if your budget doesn't have to really account for food and other expenses, so long as you're in session, at least for the work hours of the day, I don't.
Let's go ahead.
I don't know that they like. I mean, if they want to work a second job, they can. But like, I wasn't planning on restricting their salary to like 25,000 a year, which you can technically even get by on that. You're not going to live in the lap of luxury, but
Oh, I was thinking that. I was thinking they going right back. They're if uh if the average medium out if the minimum wage, like the people making the least amount of money is like around that 20 to 30K a year, like enlisted, lower enlisted, like that should be their base salary starting off. Period. They should be forced to work a second job, because if they work a second job, then they're forced to be and interact with the people around them. It shouldn't working for Congress. If you want the federal government to shrink in general, then in theory, Congress shouldn't really be doing a whole lot, to be honest. Like they should be there with a single mission, and there shouldn't be much to do, because at the end of the day, the states are doing most of the legislating within their own with their people at the state legislature level.
So then, before I get us off on specifics of salary and how we should calculate that, I do want to make sure that we finish the can they be raised or not. So it sounds like we're not at an impasse. We just disagree on whether or not the people should be able to amend it.
It seems
like.
Yeah, at least you're in the position of the people should be able to decide through the constitutional amendment process, and I'm thinking through the ballot box at least. That seems like the main disagreement. I try to compromise the Census Bureau, but
yeah, I think the Census Bureau is getting us. I think that's answering a lot of the issues that I had with the original proposal. So I guess it still leaves the one, though, of let's say I'm up on the year that the Census Bureau is there to deduct the congressional pay, then you suffer from that. And I'm not saying that Congress needs to not suffer when they go, and I think they can have a little discomfort given their history and track record. But is this Like, is
It's an opportunity
Congress's
cost. I think it's an opportunity cost I'm willing to take. Like
is
if I
Congress's pay going to be universally docked, or like my seat, my salary is docked,
it would be
and you fill that
universally
position?
it would be universally
Okay,
docked
I
in
just
my
want to be
world.
sure.
Yeah, in
Okay,
my world it would be universally docked. So for me, it's
here's
one of those. Go ahead.
I was gonna say, here's what I can give you. I could, if we're trying to compromise here and we're making a deal, I could give you their ability to dock it, but I want to set parameters on how much they can raise and lower, because I know you said that it can't outpace inflation, but let's say that you get like 30 years straight of pissed off people, which I'm assuming will be the case, and then they just vote to continue docking it. How much can it be docked each time the Census Bureau comes up and they go to the ballot box? So every 10 years, every decade. And what are the limits that we would impose then? So I will give you, let's say, for the sake of compromise, that every 10 years, the people can vote on this as well, and it will be simple majority, so 50% plus one. What would we have? What were you envisioning as the limits there, so that we don't have perpetual increases or perpetual decreases?
So a healthy inflation rate, or well, people don't consider deflation a good thing, but it depends from my perspective. But inflation in a good, healthy economy typically hovers around 2%, 3%, from what I remember my economics class.
Okay.
So I'm thinking around that 2 to 3% at the very least, and it's every 10 years. So
So
you
it's
would
a
have to
2 to
go.
3% raise or decrease that they could
Yes,
vote for.
yes,
Okay.
and I
I
would and I would
I can
venture
live with
this.
that. And if it's every 10 years and not every time a seat's up, because the other thing then, and I guess my other question then would be, is this across all of the branches? Like, obviously not the president, but like Congress and the Senate? Or are we talking
It would be
about
for
like,
both chamber. It would be for both chambers of Congress.
okay, so you would then, and would that be at just the federal level, or would that also be at
Federal.
the state level?
That'd be at the federal. The states can do whatever the heck they want. I don't care what the
Okay.
states do. I'm talking about the federal
Federal
level.
federal level, 10 years. I'm just making
And
notes
I would
because
and
remember
I
we're
would give
gonna
you this
write
as
these up.
well. And I'll give you this as well, as far as include the benefits question in there, or at least I'll give you this for the benefits portion. I'm willing to compromise and give you put that in the constitutional ingrained. So Congress cannot give themselves a benefit, or even through the Census Bureau, because I think if we every 10 years we decide whether or not that their benefits should be suspended or not every 10 years, I think that would hurt the continuity aspect.
It would. It would
And
also make it a little more volatile of a market, right? Because the very concept of at least like the long-term benefits, like their pension plans and stuff like that, we wouldn't want
it,
them to be like, "Hey, guess what? You got 70,000 this year, and then 20 years down the road, zero."
yeah, so the continuity aspect, I'm willing to give that. I'm willing to either actually, I'm willing to let that go and put that in the constitutional ingrained as far as like no benefits, because at the end of the day, like they're working a secondary job, and if they want benefits, like their secondary job can provide it for them.
Right, and they should be going back to that anyway. So, do you want to touch briefly then on? So it sounds like benefits are fixed, like that's just the way that
Yes.
they are. You're only going, so your Medicare and everything else, or they don't get Medicare, they get the good stuff. So medical coverage, eye, dental, those are only pertaining to them in their service time.
But
So
their benefits after they get out of Congress, then.
which would include like their pension and things like that. Right
Right.
now it's like 80%. And you know what? If we want to give them 80% of, the 30,000 you're talking about, that's fine. That's what do we want to do away with it? Like, personally, I don't see a reason to give them a pension. I mean, especially because you mentioned that, like, if they're not working a second job while they serve, like, let's say they're like, I just really want to focus on this, and either I have family money and I can afford it, or I can make do given where I live and what my living expenses are. I don't really care. And I don't want to, take on those extra duties. I really want to focus on serving for the limited time that I have. Let's say that there's a person like that. Well, then once they're done, they're going to go back out and get a job then, right? So that goes
Right.
back to what the framers intend, the founding fathers, when they wrote the Constitution and when they were setting this up, they were thinking you go and you serve and then you leave. So we've limited them to 20 years at the federal level, and that means that they're going to have to go get their benefits and retirement elsewhere. why are we paying through our taxpayers probably billions of dollars worth of pension things every year for them to do a crappy job? Like in my mind, I'd say throw out any of their like, you know, extra
Only
401k stuff. Like if they want to put money into it while they're in there for 20 years, whatever, that's fine. But I would say,
they're
you
cut.
know,
I
they
was gonna
don't
say.
need that.
I was gonna say. I mean, they're trying to cut benefits from the military, those who have actually done their times, and they're willing.
Yep.
And the Congress, they have much better benefits than military members. So I'm totally fine with taking away their pensions at least.
Lovely.
When they, I'm fine with that. I'm willing to like keep their benefits as far as like dental care, health care while they're in those 20 years. I'm fine with that. But as far as like their pensions and everything like that, we can make that in the make a constitutional amendment say they don't get pensions when they get done.
Health and dental while in Congress then, and then nothing after.
More or
I like
less,
that.
yeah.
Okay, good. Look at that. Look at that. We've already freed up millions and billions of dollars. I love it. We can stick that towards something else. Okay, was there, so we did get to, I don't think we've touched on the pay yet and like
So
how that would be determined. So you threw out the idea, you said 30,000, which is the average for a service, for the service
member. Yeah, for like the early years of enlistment. It's
Okay.
like $20,000 to $30,000.
Okay. Now, one thing to keep in mind with that is when you're in the military, for those who don't know, like all your food and everything else is provided, which means you've got food, you've got housing. So that's
Which it makes sense because we already compromised on letting them keep their benefits while they're in their 20-year reign.
right. So what we're saying here then is that they get the low pay because they've got similar circumstances. Now, what Congress doesn't give them that the military does is a place to stay. Right, like you get the bunkers, you get the barracks in the military. What would we do? Because you can easily spend, 50 on a reasonably priced area, and I'm thinking more like the South, right? Not the coast
Or
areas,
DC.
or DC. You're easily blowing 30,000 on rent. So I feel like what we either need to do is find a way to provide that, or we need to raise their pay or find something else. Now, let me throw out
Why
this
not?
idea.
Go ahead.
So here's an alternative we could look into: either the mean salary or the median salary of their area. So if we're talking like the federal, if we're limiting this discussion to the House of Representatives and the Senate, then for the Senate, it would be, let's say, the median salary of their state. And if it's the House of Representatives, then it would be the median salary of their district.
So you would not be in favor of universal salary then?
Not really, largely because let's say I'm a senator in Tennessee, $30,000 goes a lot further than a senator in D.C. or a senator. Actually, D.C. gets senators, don't they?
Well, here's what I was thinking. Maybe as a compromise to your idea, keep what we have so far and make it a universal salary, but let their states handle the housing situation.
Okay, so you're saying if I'm running in the state of Kentucky,
And the state of Kentucky will be the ones that'll be responsible for your housing because you're representing them technically.
okay, I see. Because if we're still letting the state representatives for the state, right? So if I'm in the Kentucky State House or the Kentucky State
State of
House
Kentucky,
of Representatives,
yeah,
then Kentucky can do whatever they want with that. But if I am representing the state of Kentucky in the U.S. House or the U.S. Senate, then Kentucky gets to subsidize my housing situation.
yeah, and the people can decide in the state of Kentucky how to go about that.
I actually like that a lot because all of them are living in DC or close to it, which means that, yeah, their states can decide how much they like that particular senator or congressperson. So universal salary, states. I'm just jotting these down so that when we do our compromise discussion.
At the end of this three-branch
What is
series.
Ryan and Ken's
Constitutional amendments for these three branches? For the three branches.
No, I think that was a creative way to kind of bridge the gap between the two. What else did we want to get through in this segment?
Okay, so the second point I had, so it looks like we got through the first point. That whole shebang was about pretty much how Congress is going to get paid and how the whole pay increase is going to work out. So it looks like we finally got through that. The second point I had on here was any citizen who aspires to run for office must have a minimum of 16 years without any association with lobbying to minimize conflict of interest. Which it doesn't seem like you have too much of a gripe with that. I don't know. Am I wrong?
When you say 16 years, I guess I'm confused. So is this 16 of the 20 years? Like what is this going towards? What are these qualifications for again? Is this to run for the U.S. House or Senate?
Yes, yeah, for either one. So if you're trying to run for House or Senate, you cannot have at least before you enter the 20-year reign, you cannot have any associated with any lobbyists for at least a 16-year period. So the House of Representatives, for example, which is like the eligible age is 25, I think. Before you turn 25, there has to be at least a 16-year period before you turn 25 where you had no association with lobbying, at least. And then you can enter as Congress in that 20-year cap, but you can't be a lobbyist. As I mentioned in the first point, you can't be a lobbyist as a secondary job or be paid by lobbyists either.
While you're in Congress, that definitely makes sense. And I do understand where you're coming from with this concern. My concern coming out of that is, where does the freedom of speech go, freedom of association, etc.? Because, I understand the problems that come about from, hey, I was a lobbyist, I have all these connections for big oil or, radical green energy, and then I go into Congress and they're obviously funding me. And if I'm remembering correctly off the top of my head, lobbyists and corporations, all that, like, there's really not a lot of restriction on how much they can lobby and what they can do, because the Supreme Court ruled that it's freedom of speech, like where you invest your money and how you invest it. So I would need to brush up on that again to be 100% certain. But my biggest concern is, how would that not be ruled unconstitutional, other than the fact that, it'd be constitutional here because it's the Constitution. But like, how are we, let me put it this way, how are we not trampling on freedom of speech and freedom of association by limiting what you can do beforehand? Because I understand during, that makes sense, because obviously I shouldn't be able to work for a lobbyist company as my side hustle while I'm also supposed to be representing my district, right? Like, that might be a conflict of interest. I could see that as a reasonable restriction. But for 16 years beforehand, like, I mean, that would mean that, like, none of my early career could I do something like that I'm passionate for. And also, if I wait, like, I mean, I don't know, I couldn't do that. Like, let's say I was doing that right now and I was like, oh man, I want to do this. Now I have to wait 16 years. How are we not trampling on freedom of speech with that?
So is 16 years, 16 years is too long, the time frame's too long?
No, my main concern is that by placing any limitation on there, I feel like you're basically trampling on free speech there, because freedom of association.
And my concern is, let's say there is no limit and you've had that background experience and you enter the cab, like, who's to say behind closed doors you're still going to get paid by lobbyists to pass certain bills that they want to accomplish, whether it's radical or moderate, it doesn't really matter. You still have that association, you still have that connection and so for me, having that 16-year gap and makes me feel comfortable that this person is not coming in with their own agenda, and they're less likely, I should say, a lot less likely to be corrupt from within.
So when we do debate and we attack arguments, we have this idea called uniqueness, right? So uniqueness means that if I say this is a non-unique issue, what I mean by that is that it's going to be there one way or the other. And I'm worried that what you've just pointed out there is not unique to the system at all, because right now we have like, let's say you get someone squeaky clean, you're going to get picked up by people who back your agenda, right? So if I've never done anything, and then I run and I'm like, yeah, big oil, drill baby drill, guess who's going to fund my campaigns? People who are tied to that sector, right? Same for green energy, etc. So I feel like even if I was never associated with them, I'll still get picked up with them directly, indirectly, or even if there's like 3 or 4 degrees between me and that company, they will still fund my platform to some extent. So I'm worried that on top of trampling on top of the First Amendment here and the ability to have freedom of association, I feel like even if you try to make them squeaky clean, like you were talking about, I feel like you're still going to get the influence of lobbyists, and we can't restrict lobbyists because freedom of speech. So I'm coming from that perspective. I don't know what you think on that.
Okay, so you do agree as far as once you're in that 20-year cap, the lobbying from within, you're against. You agree with that, I'm assuming, right?
Right. I don't think that you need to be affiliated with lobbyists, but actually, I don't know what is the status quo? Are you shouldn't be tied to lobbyists, but you are. I don't remember.
Remember exact off the top of my head, but I know a lot of Congress members or like when they leave Congress, they become lobbyists for the new
Right.
Congress members, and there's like that conflict of interest at that point. Um, and so I'm against that. That's one of the main concerns with lobbying. And so maybe when it comes to okay, I'm willing
Here's
to
the
let go. Go ahead.
I can give you the Political Reform Act requires individuals, businesses, and other organizations that make or receive payments to influence this is state government decisions, such as advocating for or against legislative bills and state agency regulations. They're required to register as lobbyists and submit periodic reports of their lobbying activity. So here's my understanding then, based off of that and some other things I'm thinking of. You you have to basically have a way to track this, right? Like I can be funded by these companies, but that needs to be transparent. So that's kind of what I'm understanding is the status quo, that like you have to be registered as a lobbyist and people need to know, oh, Ryan is being funded by OPEC. So when he says I'm all about EVs, we know he's full of it, right? Like I think that's kind of how they balance that. So with that in mind, what were you saying?
Well, I was saying, if anything, I'm willing to let go of the 16 years free of association because of
Okay,
the freedom of speech, because I think that gets too subjective at that
sure.
point. And you kind of brought up a good point as far as like how would you track that, and which kind of contradicts my point earlier as far as my concern about how do you track the family members, as far as how do you know these Congress members and their family members are not their immediate family,
Right.
they're close.
IRS, baby.
IRS, and let's be honest, the IRS is not going to be 87,000 people forever. At least I hope not, anyway. But
Yeah, it'll probably get bigger. We'll see.
it depends. But so that'll be like really hard to follow or track. So I'm willing to let that
Sure.
go as long as we can keep in there. Can't be lobbyists themselves in there, and they can't, or the lobbyists, because like you said, they're going to have to be associated with them at some point. The lobbyists cannot be former Congress members. And I think
Sure.
that's a lot easier to track.
Well, and here's the thing: I'm even willing to stick a pin in this and return not what you just mentioned, but just thinking of how complex lobbying is. I think we should address that as a whole separate thing. Take some time to brush up on the current rules, see if we want to reform it. But I think what you proposed, as far as they can't be lobbyists themselves during those 20 years, and a few restrictions, I would be open to that, and I'd really like to dive deeper into that, like what types of transparency should we be enforcing so that you have freedom of speech and freedom of support and association with your money, but also balance that with transparency for the people.
Yeah, that's fair. So that's that. And
Okay, so real quick, state so I can take this for our notes. We're not going to do the 16-year rule, but they cannot be lobbyists, and they're not supposed to be affiliated with lobbyists while they're in office, basically.
more or less, and if they have any association, it cannot be a former Congress member who became a lobbyist after they got out.
Gotcha. Okay, good. Yep, go ahead.
Let's see the electoral process. Oh, we already went over this. I guess we kind of
Yeah.
hit two birds with one stone with the pay and the ballot box situation. Now, as far as like, let's say hypothetically this gets ratified, how would this, as far as their pay and everything like that, how do you think two presidential cycles is a sufficient amount of time to adjust the system to adjust
What
for
do
the
you mean?
pay and everything? Because they're getting paid like $200,000 a year, Congress on average right now.
Sure.
And let's say this gets ratified, and they're going to see their pay go from 200,000 $40,000 a year. So I'm thinking like two presidential cycles is enough time to phase into this new system where they're not being paid like kings and queens.
No, I agree with that. That kicks it down the road a little bit.
That gives them some time, the United States time. So that's all the points I had. I don't know if you had any extra you wanted to go over, but I think we've reached a natural ending point for tonight.
All right, Ken, thank you for spearheading this series. It's always a pleasure to work with you. Remember, you can find Between the Liars on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, Twitch, and Google Podcasts. And you can follow us on our social medias to stay updated at Between the Liars. Give Ken a follow at Kenjin_Express. And if you enjoy this show, go give us a 5-star review and share us with your friends. Help us envision a better, smaller, more accountable government. That starts with a blueprint. Goodbye for now.